Hi, I'm Eric. Welcome back to Not an Audio Review channel where I don't review audio gear. They're doing some construction outside my apartment again. That's always nice for my sanity, so apologies for any noise that gets picked up. Now, once upon a time, back in the day before even I was around, all loudspeakers you see looked more or less like this. They had a single large driver in a box hooked up to an amplifier, and that was basically it. Now, a single driver trying to reproduce the entire spectrum of human hearing has some problems. Like, keep in mind that if you hear two notes playing at the same time, what you're really hearing is the speaker driver essentially vibrating the higher notes in between the vibrations of the lower notes. And that includes not just the fundamentals of the notes, but all the higher harmonic information that makes one instrument or voice sound different from another one. If I can find it, I'll put a clip of Dank Pods talking about this because he's funnier than I am.
These big bass notes in between, it's doing the mids and upper. It's crazy. It all comes out of one piece of plastic or paper.
If only I had an Australian accent, this channel would have 10 times more subscribers. But anyway, it's just a lot harder for the same driver to make both big low vibrations and tiny high note vibrations at the same time. You might be thinking now, what about headphones? Almost all of those only use a single driver per channel, and they don't have problems reproducing the whole frequency response. And you're right. They basically get away with it because they're operating at much lower volumes than loudspeakers, and they're right up against your ears, so it's just easier for the driver to make quiet noises than loud ones. But for loudspeakers, single drivers tend to have problems. If they're large, they might be able to make some very low notes, but they struggle in the treble, where they roll off and get something called cone breakup, where the amplifier doesn't have adequate control of the driver and you get this wonky frequency response that can sound arguably uneven, unnatural, or harsh. And before I go on, let me just note that this video is brought to you by my Patreon at patreon.com/notareview channel, where you get episodes early and ad-free exclusive content and more, all for only $1. And also don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, so the solution to the problems of single driver speakers was simply to add more drivers, starting with the two-way design that's still super common, where you have one driver called a tweeter doing the high notes and another driver called a woofer doing the low notes. This is why a subwoofer is called that, if you don't know, because it makes notes that are even lower than what a woofer makes. And if you have a driver between the tweeter and the woofer, it's called a mid-range or a squawker, because why not? And if you have even more drivers, those also have names probably, but I don't actually care at this point. And there's stuff like line arrays, but look, stop distracting me, okay? I'm trying to make a point here. Now, of course, the problem here is that the signal coming out of the amplifier usually has the whole audio spectrum, which means you need some way of separating the highs from the lows. And so the crossover was invented. Now, the way this is generally done, at least in passive speakers, but we'll get to active speakers in a bit, is to split the signal into two parts, one for each driver, and then use some capacitors, resistors, and maybe some inductors to filter out the high notes from the signal going to the woofer and the low notes from the signal going to the tweeter. And obviously, if your speaker has 3 or more drivers, they're splitting and adjusting that signal more. I'm not going to explain the physics of that here. Maybe one day, don't forget to subscribe. But another thing you can do with these sorts of components is to alter the signal, raise or lower certain frequencies and things in order to tune the particular driver and make it more accurate. If you look at my JBL L82 classic speakers, you can see they have this little knob, and this knob is just a resistor potentiometer that increases or decreases the resistance on the signal going to the tweeter so that you can make the speaker brighter or darker, tweak the sound a bit to your tastes. And essentially what this is passive EQ. And traditional analog EQs just have networks of these resistor and capacitor arrangements to attune different frequencies. The problem with crossovers is that if you look at a frequency response breakdown of what part of the signal each driver covers, it's not that at one frequency one driver stops and the other one starts. Instead, one driver tapers off while the next one ramps up. And so for part of the frequency response, both drivers are playing the same thing. This is the crossover of the crossover, so to speak. And so part of the task of the speaker designer is to make this crossover section as smooth as possible. Though particularly with lower end speakers, you can find little dips where the crossover happens. And that's the kind of thing you can look for in an FR graph when evaluating a speaker. And there's also a sense that the tone of the speaker may not be quite the same where the crossover is happening, because two drivers playing at the same time isn't going to sound exactly the same as one driver simply due to their physical properties. Like they might have slightly different harmonic distortion profiles, and there can be issues with the phase and the timing because capacitors can delay the signal going through them slightly, and different drivers behave differently, so they might become slightly out of sync with each other, or even in reverse phase where the sound waveforms are inverted and cancel each other out at certain frequencies. Like crossover design can get tricky. On top of this, as I discovered with my amp camp preamp plus headphone amp and upgrading its input and output capacitors, putting the signal through a capacitor will color the sound a bit, and this is why crossover designers often fiend over using particular caps to get the speakers to sound the way they want them to. And so some people maintain that single driver designs, or full range, since they reproduce the full range of the frequency response, still work better, and that speakers with crossovers can never achieve quite the same coherent, natural mid-range that single driver speakers have, despite the issues they often have with bass and treble reproduction. Another advantage of full range speakers is that two drivers naturally require more amplification power than one driver. As mentioned in my headphone amp with speaker outputs video, it ironically takes more power to make a small speaker driver produce big bass notes than a large one. Most small bookshelf speakers with multiple drivers are incredibly inefficient, which is why they didn't really emerge until the invention of solid-state amplification, which could typically produce much more power than the old tube amps could. However, a small single-driver speaker might still be run off some exotic low-power triode tube amp or Class A 20-watt solid-state amp or something. For this reason, I once bought a pair of full-range desktop speakers, the Closer Ogys, which are a low-power friendly 91 dB sensitive and have a cute design, and I got a 20-watt Schiit Magni 1 to run them, and it did that just fine. The Ogys got some spectacular reviews, and we're supposed to have magical mid-range, and being an addict of the Sennheiser HD6XX, which is a mid-range focused design, not known for high treble or sub-bass, I was more than happy to have something that might be the speaker equivalent of this. To my surprise, though, I didn't like the Ogys at all.
No, sir, I don't like it.
Now, they did have some fine qualities. There was a kind of vivid immediacy to the sound and crazy good imaging and layering and even slam, which surprised me. But the treble sounded a bit harsh and uneven to me, and that was pretty certainly due to cone breakup. And the second thing was that there was a distinctly nasal quality to the sound of everything. If you look at the frequency response measurements I took with a U-mic and REW, you can see there's not only this unevenness in the treble, but there's an odd peak at 1K, which I think explains the nasal sound. And as always, don't pay attention to the weirdness in the bass. That's room modes caused by my room acoustics, not the speakers. In fact, if you look at the measurements I took of the Q Acoustic Concept 30 and an NBD Tower 4s, you can see they're mostly the same, save for a slight recess in the treble from the QC30s and more bass extension from the T4s. But when you overlay the Ogy measurements, you can see the breakup in the treble and the odd peak at 1K. Now, other people haven't reported this nasal sound issue, so I don't know what's going on. Maybe it's something specific about the combination of the speakers in my room acoustics or the response to the Azure. I've heard they sound better with tube amps, but yeah, I really can't say. But I gave up trying to fix the issue with EQ and just returned the speakers, and I figured that was that. Full rangers just weren't for me. Too bad. And then sometime later, as I was building amps, I realized that I wanted some test speakers. Something not very expensive so I wouldn't be too sad if I'd plugged them into a faulty amp and killed them. And also small so they wouldn't take up too much space in my New York apartment. And I wanted to try building speakers because I've never done that. So I came upon the idea of building these. Now these are the Copperhead desktop speakers available as a kit from PartsExpress. You can see my children decorated them a bit, and I think they did wonderful job. I mean, look at how awesome that Pikachu is. Come on, that's crazy. And this, according to my 4-year-old son, is both Mr. Potato Head and me. Anyway, to build these, you'll need some polyfoam and or polyfill. This is polyfill, and you want some wood glue and some clamps. Clamps here. Yeah, and a drill and some sandpaper. I don't know where my sandpaper went actually. And you'll need a soldering iron and I forgot a clamp, you guys. How could you forgive me? I forgot one of my clamps. And you'll need a soldering iron and a solder and maybe some wood oil or stain or something, though I left mine unfinished. I think you'll agree that my kids' decorations are better than any stain. But that's it. And honestly, they're not hard to build at all, much easier than most amps I've made, and would be a fun project to do with a crafty kid. Get this out of here. Put all this stuff here. Anyway, okay. Now, these speakers don't have a crossover, but they do come with some capacitors, resistors, and inductors to tune the sound to give a better response. In fact, on the recommendation of my friend Parker, I upgraded a couple of the capacitors with a pair of these $8 each Audine capacitors. And so even a lot of passive full-range speakers have this issue of capacitors and how they may or may not color the sound. And I made some mistakes when I was building these because this wouldn't be one of my projects if I didn't make some mistakes, apparently. Most glaringly, I accidentally put the front panel of this speaker backwards, which means there's no recess for the driver like there's supposed to be. And so it's not flush. And because the wood glue hardens as hard as wood, there's no way to fix this without cutting the panel out with a saw, which is not something I'm going to do. So that was dumb. If you make a pair of these yourself, don't do that. And these speakers surprised me because they didn't have the nasal sound I heard with the Ogys at all. Here's a graph of the Copperhead measurements laid on the top of the Ogys, and you can see that while the frequency response isn't exactly what you'd call flat, it is flatter in my room than the Ogys were and even has more treble extension. And it's also kind of funny that they essentially eliminate the problem of the room modes in the bass by having no bass at all. Though this is another reason they're easy to drive besides having only one driver. Like, you could probably run these fine on just a handful of watts. And with my subwoofer engaged, you can actually get pretty decent low end. And honestly, if you were listening to them in isolation, they do sound shockingly good, especially considering their size and how much they cost. And the mid-range is just really phenomenal, sounding incredibly organic and natural, particularly with acoustic instruments. Like, you put an acoustic guitar in these, and it sounds like there's someone literally playing a guitar in front of you. And you get that same sense of vivid immediacy as I found with the Ogys. The problem with them, unsurprisingly, is the treble. You can see this compared to the QC30s and the T4s, which emphasizes its unevenness. This might not be a big deal for some folks, especially with a bit of EQ, but if you're treble sensitive as I am, well, I have trouble listening to them for more than a couple hours at most. Like, you just kind of need a tweeter to get refinement in the treble. A bit of EQ does help this, though. Still, particularly for someone with an interest or curiosity about DIY on a budget with limited space, you could pair these with a small sub and a cheap low-power amp like a Schiit Gjallarhorn, which has the benefit of being deskable, or a cheapish tube amp like the Douk A5, or I was running these for a while in the $250 20-watt Class A BRZ hi-fi clone of the Musical Fidelity A1 that you can get on AliExpress, and that seemed to pair perfectly with these speakers. Or a lower power DIY amp like the Amp Camp amp from the DIY audio store would probably be great with these. It would be another great beginner project and a lot of fun. Or if you want cheap, I got this Douk A5 amp on sale for $38. And this also sounds surprisingly good with these speakers. You can even upgrade the op amps if that's your thing, but I did a whole other episode about that. Anyway, for contrast now, let's compare these with another pair of small speakers that in some way represents the opposite end in terms of how they're designed. So these are the iLoud micro monitors. I bought them on sale for $220. These are a two-way speaker, both tweeter and woofer. They're also powered and active. Now, powered means that unlike the Copperheads, these don't need an external amplifier at all because the amplifier is built into the speakers. This is something that's become common with the development of Class D amplification, where you can make a really powerful amp fit inside the cabinet of even a tiny loudspeaker like this one. And so this is a pretty good deal, really, and easy to set up, and you can get an 1/8 inch to RCA cable like that, or an 1/8 inch to 1/8 inch cable, and plug it straight into the headphone jack of your computer. Boom. Or you can connect it to an Apple dongle, connect it to your phone, or you can even just connect these to your computer wirelessly over Bluetooth, though that isn't lossless for us purists. Or you can do what I used to do and get a compact DAC headphone amp preamp stack like this Schiit Magni Modi, and have a USB cable from your computer to the DAC, RCA cable from the Magni to the micro monitors, and now you have a complete desk solution you can use for headphones, and you have a nice knob to adjust the volume for the speakers as nature intended. Now, Class D amplifiers built into the speaker is also how a portable Bluetooth speaker, like you might have, like this one, works. And this just has a battery instead of needing to be plugged into the wall. This is a JBL Pulse 5 Bluetooth speaker. And in fact, this technically is a full range speaker too, just with a bass reflex port at the bottom. Editing Eric here. So I was completely wrong about this. This is not a single driver speaker at all. It's actually what's called a coaxial speaker, which means the tweeter is actually mounted in the middle of the woofer, which is a whole thing I'm not going to get into here. But it's actually a pretty clever design with the coaxial at the top and the bass reflex port on the bottom. Also, I didn't show you what it looks like when I turn it on. Cool, right? You can change the colors, and it kind of dances around when there's music playing through it, like a lava lamp in a speaker had a baby. Anyway, and yet the treble on this thing sounds fine to me. And I can only assume that's the result of carefully adjusted DSP, which brings me to what active means. You see, you can put an analog signal into these speakers, but there's an ADC, or analog to digital converter, in there that converts it to digital. This allows it to do two things. One, you remember how I said crossover components can color the sound and how there can be problems with them not evenly crossing over the frequencies? Well, the micro monitors get around that by doing the crossover entirely in the digital realm. Inside here is a computer chip programmed to take the digital information from the ADC, split it cleanly into the frequencies required for the drivers, and convert it back to analog and amplify it, probably at the same time because you can sync a digital signal with the on-off pulses of a Class D amp, removing the need for a separate DAC component. Wow. And the second thing it does is, rather than needing passive components to tune the sound to the drivers like the Copperheads do, these use digital signal processing, aka DSP, to basically EQ the signal for the speakers in a way that, at least in theory, is much more precise. And more than that, this lets it do tricks. Like if you look at the back, you see these switches to raise the treble and lower the bass, which is cool, but the JBL LLE2s do more variation than that. But this switch adjusts the EQ so that the speakers are tuned based on whether you're using them on a desk or on stands. Now, normally putting your speakers directly on a desk or another flat surface is not great acoustically, because the sound waves hit the desk and bounce back up and interfere with the other sound waves, causing distortion. But this setting compensates for that with DSP to give you a more flat response. On top of that, these little guys can produce crazy low bass. In a very real way, the Copperheads are very old tech, going all the way back almost to the beginning of electronic amplification, while the micro monitors represent the most up-to-date way of doing things, the way actually used in professional recording studios, which almost all rely on active monitors with DSP these days. Actually, one thing that annoys me about the micro monitors is that despite that everything becomes digital inside them, Bluetooth is the only digital input it has. If it had a USB port, for example, you could plug a USB cable directly from your phone and you wouldn't need a dongle and you wouldn't need to use the headphone jack in your computer with its built-in DAC or any other DAC. One of the micro monitor's competitors is the Vanuatu Zeros, which I've never heard, but they've gotten rave reviews. Those cost more and they're a bit bigger, but they also have a desk mode and they have more treble and bass adjustments, a remote, subwoofer output, and a bunch of other features, and they have a digital input through USB or optical. So that seems like a more complete package, though it doesn't have the price and form factor advantage of the micro monitors, which kind of have a reputation for high value for a reason. $600 though will get you the iLoud Micro Monitor Pros, which does have a USB port, balanced input, and a few more features, but not quite as many as the Vanuatu's, but still with a smaller form factor. And iLoud has a whole bunch of more sophisticated little speakers that cost over $1,000 for a pair, but that's going head-to-head with Genelec, which are kind of the standard bearers for tiny active speakers in that price category. And now we're getting way out of the scope of this video. Seriously, why are you distracting me and leading me off on these digressions again? So how do these sound? Well, here's the frequency response of these things. And in this case, I put the mic right up to the speaker to minimize the effect of the room just for comparison. Probably should have done that with the Ogys too, but too late now. And you can see the micro monitors are remarkably flat. There's a bit of bump in the bass around 55 hertz, which is probably still the room, after which it rolls off, though it's still getting basically the average SPL as far down as 45 hertz, which on speakers this tiny is pretty incredible. There is this odd dip around 3K, not sure what that's about, but this is still a remarkably flat response. And here's the Copperheads, measured the same way and overlaid on the micro monitors. You can see there's obviously a lot less bass, and the treble kind of goes crazy after 6K, which is the cone breakup in action. But the mid-range is incredibly flat, basically on par with the micro monitors, if not a little better, because it doesn't have that dip that starts around 3K. Not bad for cheap little single driver speakers, right? In fact, if you measure the two of them next to each other on my desk with the micro monitors in desk mode, the measurements are a lot more similar than you might expect. I would take these measurements with a grain of salt, though. There's stuff on my desk, and I would not claim these measurements were done in any kind of scientific way. But yeah, the iLouds definitely sound more accurate, clean, and neutral. Maybe a little boring if I'm being honest, but when you're used to chocolate milk, regular milk tastes boring too, you know? And these are marketed for mixing and mastering music in a small space. And for that purpose, they're great, because what you want is something that's basically dead neutral. They don't have the, shall we say, life and fun of the Copperheads, but they're not really trying to. Nor would I call their sound especially organic or natural in the way that the Copperheads can spookily sound like real instruments. But the treble sure doesn't give me any issues. In fact, even without EQ, the treble on these are pretty palatable to me, which might have something to do with their size or something, I don't know. And there's lots of bass. These have probably the best layering and clarity of soundstage I've ever heard in anything this size. Like, it's kind of astonishing when you first hear it and you're like, how is something this small making this kind of sound? And if you want a little more flavor, you could pair it with a more colored preamp, even something with tubes. Like, I bet the little A-Post Gremlin hybrid tube amp would be really fun with these if you wanted to tube them up a little for not a lot of money. Those would probably also be good with the Copperheads, of course, too, though you need a power amp also with the Copperheads. I don't normally do sound clips because they're never going to sound the same as this gear would in your room. They're being picked up by whatever mic I'm using and translated back to digital by whatever ADC I'm using, and then they're getting compressed and lossified by YouTube and then translated back to analog and played on whatever gear you have and so on. But with those caveats, I wanted to play a sound recording of these two speakers just so you can get a sense of their different characters. The Copperheads here are getting the benefit of my whole chain, the Eversolo T8 to the DirectStream DAC to the Associate to the Parasound A23 power amp, which with 160 watts into 8 ohms is way overkill for these speakers. Meanwhile, the micro monitors are just getting the headphone jack from my Mac piped into them, which is kind of hilarious. But for our purposes here, I don't think it really matters. The differences between the source gear is going to translate a lot less well here than the differences between the speakers. And I'm not trying to convince you the Copperheads are better. I'm just trying to get you a general sense of the relative sound of these speakers. Now, let's be clear with both of these. They're still not going to sound like actually big speakers can sound. Like particularly near field at my desk, my huge NBD ML-TL6 speakers are able to envelop me in the music in a way small speakers just can't. And that's simply a function of physics. Like these big drivers can just physically push more air at once. The bigger speakers are also, especially in near field, less sensitive to room acoustics. And of course, if you want to fill up a room for far field listening, speakers like these aren't really what you want, and it's not what they're designed for. You might be able to get volume out of them, like you could set them up next to your TV and hear them from your couch, and they'd pretty certainly still sound better than whatever shit speakers are inside your TV, but they're never going to sound as full and complete in that situation as a bigger speaker will. But these are desktop speakers, and most people aren't crazy enough to put speakers as big as the MLTL6 in a desktop situation. And especially if you need to actually fit the speakers on a desk, these are the kind of solutions you want. And I kind of feel like these two sets of speakers represent two different kinds of audiophiles, or even two different kinds of people. Like, do you want something that's relentlessly clean and neutral? iLoud micro monitors. Do you want something that's fun and unusual and will give you a sound like nothing you've ever heard before, and maybe like tinkering and building things yourself and tweaking and trying different amplifiers to see what they sound like? Copperheads. And I admit, I get a little frustrated sometimes with the way audio folks talk about these things. Like there's people you'll find who will say straight out that single driver speakers always sound more real and natural because they don't have crossovers and therefore are always the best. And that DSP destroys sound quality. And there's other people who say stuff that's DSP'd to an inch of its life is the maximum in fidelity and measurements are all that matter. And as humans, we desperately want things to be black and white and easy to understand. But in reality, there's just nuance and different people are after different sorts of things. And that's fine. That's great, actually. That's the stuff that makes the hobby fun. So yeah, which kind of speaker listener are you? Tag yourself in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe while you're down there. And support me on Patreon at patreon.com/notareview-channel and get early ad-free episodes, exclusive content, chat with me, all for a mere $1. What more could you want? This I ask you. Lots of things probably, but this is what I've got. Thanks as always to my patrons who are obviously the best kind of audiophiles of all. Bye.